All right. Yeah. Thanks again for being here. And let's just dive right into breaking the burnout cycle at work. So, first, just a very brief introduction of myself. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Maria Stoyadinova. I am a certified burnout and stress management coach, and I'm the founder of Rest Over Grind LLC. I bring to this work two different types of experience that are in some ways quite different and in some ways not so different. So I bring 5+ years of coaching experience where I have been working with high achieving professionals, teaching them how to work sustainably, how to stay high performing without sacrificing quality of work, but also without just operating on high stress at all times. And I also have 18 years of experience working in the corporate world, working in economic consulting, where I worked on antitrust mergers and litigation. And throughout that time period, I basically started this job as an economist in consulting straight out of college. So I know what it's like to be kind of entry level, not kind of exactly entry level at the job. Um, and dealing with all of those stressors and uncertainties there, and also how to then progress to junior manager, senior manager, and the different and in many ways similar stressors that come with those different positions. And throughout that job, it was a very kind of demanding and high stress job. So I personally experienced a lot of the things that I teach. I have experienced myself, and I know exactly what they feel like. So I'm bringing both of those lenses in as the coach and as the person who's been in the corporate world doing the thing and experiencing the high stress and the burnout. All right, so with that, I want to just dive right in. I want to talk about the three most common internal stressors in the workplace, and I want to emphasize here the word internal because what I don't want I don't want people to assume is that I'm kind of ignoring all of the external things that happen in the workplace that can be incredibly stressful, such as, the tight deadlines, the client, if you're in a client-facing job, kind of the client's demands, utilization demands, which is something that happens in consulting a lot. Um, Everything like managers who maybe are have a little bit of like a wonky management style or who don't take into consideration people's kind of personal lives, like all of those things exist in the workplace. And I'm not trying to minimize them at all. They are 100% causes for a lot of work stress. And the one thing that I want to also teach and emphasize for people is that waiting for those things to change is not great for you personally because you don't have a ton of control over whether those things change or how quickly. And so if we only say like, well, yeah, I would be less stressed if my company was different, if the work culture was different, if my manager was better, like that's when I would be less stressed, then that's a recipe for just being perpetually stressed. And over time, again, like as stress accumulates over time, you get burnt out from it. So waiting for the circumstances externally to change before you feel less stressed, I don't want that for you because that just means you're going to get stuck in that cycle. So that's where a lot of the internal stressors come in. And if we have a lot of internalized patterns that contribute to that stress cycle and to that work stress. And as we address those internalized patterns, we can actually make our experience at work significantly better, even without any of those external things changes. That doesn't mean you're cool with all the external stressors and you kind of don't care about them anymore. You can still advocate for yourself and for your colleagues. You can still have those conversations. You can still care about all of those things externally. It's just you're actually going to have a lot more capacity to do that once you've addressed those internalized patterns and have reduced your stress with the things that you can control. And then you also have a lot more capacity to advocate for the things that you cannot directly control, but you can still have an opinion and have a role to play in, again, in advocacy, if nothing else. All right, so the three kind of main internal stressors that I've seen in my career and in my experience as a coach as well. that people experience in the workplace, I call them the three Ps because they kind of boil down to three broad categories. Number one is perfectionism, number two is people pleasing, and number three is procrastination. And procrastination kind of is almost a side effect of the other two, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I'll explain what I mean by each of the three because there's many different definitions out there for each of these concepts. Well, maybe not for procrastination, although there's some debate there too. But for perfectionism, like a lot of people don't actually know what I mean when I say like perfectionism exhausts you because they think, and I used to think for the longest time, perfectionism is great, right? It just means I care a lot about my work, I'm really careful, and I do a great job. Actually, no. That's not what I mean when I say perfectionism. I know that's how a lot of us think about it, but perfectionism actually is doing a lot of unnecessary stuff that actually doesn't contribute to the end product. Yes, there is maybe a dose of like really deeply caring about your work that contributes to the quality of the work. Undeniably, of course. I don't consider that to be perfectionism. Perfectionism is kind of imagining this perfect, unrealistic result, not being able to meet it, beating yourself up for it, freezing because you can't meet it, panicking and stressing because you can't meet it, delaying results trying to meet it. That's very different than focusing on doing a great job and doing the great job. So that's what I mean when I say perfectionism, all the unnecessary stuff that doesn't actually contribute to the work product, it just contributes to being stressed all the time. Then people pleasing, the way that that shows up in the workplace specifically is often by overcommitting our time, not being able to say when we're at capacity or when we're not able to work like over the weekend, let's say, over promising results, struggling to communicate your boundaries. That those are the ways in which it shows up in the workplace. And it's essentially always about trying to prevent somebody from being upset with us, which we really can't control. And I'll talk about that in a second too, but really kind of trying to stay safe from a place of like, well, I want to do everything possible so that people love me, so that I stay safe. But we go about it in kind of this counterproductive way, is what I want to say, in this way that isn't actually like, again, we can't control what people think about us, but when we like try so hard, we actually just end up exhausting ourselves and doing a bunch of weird things that are not helpful to us or others often. And then procrastination, I think we're all familiar with that concept of like losing hours every day, kind of being frustrated with yourself that you've lost those hours, then working late or like trying to work under pressure to fulfill your deadlines. All right, so diving into perfectionism first. So, perfectionism, like I mentioned in the previous slide, is really this kind of aspiration to do an unrealistic work product. And it really impedes your ability to see nuance and to recognize where you can do great work without trying to make it perfect. People always say like perfect, that I used to hear that a lot and it used to drive me insane actually, when people said that to me because recovering perfectionist here. When people used to say perfect is the enemy of the good, I would always think I don't want to just be good. I want to be great. What are you talking about? Like, of course, this is not helpful at all. What I think is more helpful as a framing is perfect is the enemy of you doing your best work. That is actually the more accurate description. So it's not that it's either good or perfect. It's either great or it's you running yourself ragged and exhausted and stressing all the time. Those are the options, and that doesn't actually help you do the great work. And it impedes, again, it impedes our ability to see nuance. In the perfectionist brain, it's either great or it's trash. There's nothing in between. And again, like most of the great work in the world, if not all, is actually in between those two because the perfect is like way out here in fantasy land. And then as a result of that perfectionism and that all or nothing thinking, what ends up happening is we end up overcomplicating things and spending a lot of time on unnecessary tasks, such as, like, let's say, writing a 10 paragraph email instead of just summarizing the key takeaways from some, like, whatever you want to share. I myself have done that a lot over my career. I've gotten feedback about that of like, your emails are way too complicated. Like, what are you doing? We don't even know what's happening. And that used to come exactly from that perfectionism of like, I need to say everything possible on this subject, and if I don't, then it's not perfect, and then it's actually horrible work. And I got consistent feedback of like, no, you're actually overcomplicating things and making them worse in the process by trying to make them perfect. So, and of course, like that also meant me staying hours and hours late to draft the 10 paragraph email and all the details and proofread it 20 times instead of just a few talking points. Perfectionism also shows up as you formatting a presentation for 2 extra hours after it was already in great shape. So basically, like at 7 p.m., you send the presentation that is identical to the one you would have sent at 5 p.m., but you just spent those 2 extra hours like tinkering with things and trying to put the cherry on top, and at the end, it's the same. The same thing, if anything, it might be more complicated again. Rereading an email like 20 times before sending it when you already know it's in pretty good shape. Again, so sort of just doing a lot of unnecessary work. If anything, like what from my personal estimates, this is not scientific estimate, but from what I've observed in myself and my clients and my colleagues at work, perfectionists spend about honestly a third of their time and energy trying to put that cherry on top of the work product that is already really strong. And that time and energy can be way better spent doing other things so that you're more caught up on your to-do list, resting, doing things you enjoy in your life, all of those things that are way more productive than just trying to tinker with the details. Right. The other thing that happens with perfectionism, other than like spending a lot of unnecessary time trying to put the cherry on top of things, is we freeze. And this is where perfectionism and procrastination actually often intersect. Because out of that overwhelm and that desire to make things perfect, we often overwhelm a nervous system. So we get a task, and instead of like working on the task, here's what happens. Let's say it takes you 3 hours to do a great job on a task. Without that perfectionism and that tendency to try to make it extra, extra perfect, what happens is that you get the task, you work on it, you don't have any of the kind of mental and nervous system drama around it. And between hours 0 and 3, you work on the task, you finish it, you do a great job. And then between hours 3 and 6, you move on with your life. You maybe finish another task, or if it's the end of the workday, you go home and enjoy your life. You do other things in those 3 hours. What happens with perfectionism is you get the task, your brain starts freaking out about all the tiny things that you perceive as imperfect and like all the ways in which you could not make the end product perfect. You panic about like, how am I gonna mess this up? And you get overwhelmed. And then you kind of stress and freeze and often procrastinate. You get overwhelmed by the task, and instead of working on the task, you open your email and you decide to like sort your emails suddenly when that's not urgent. Or you start working on another task that is not at all urgent and you ignore the urgent task that feels overwhelming. Or you, if you're working from home, you decide to like go clean your kitchen. I've done that a number of times. You're like just basically you're overwhelmed and your nervous system is like, nope, we need to look somewhere else. We'll start this task later. Right now it's too much. Or you open your phone and start scrolling. You get the picture. This is where like whether it's productive procrastination or any other type of procrastination, you spend 3 hours in this kind of frozen stress state that you know you want to be working on it, but you're not because it feels too daunting and overwhelming. So then you're at hour 3. The only thing you've accomplished is visualizing this unrealistic performance and procrastinating for 3 hours. Then maybe it's hour 3 and you're like, oh, shoot, I need to like submit this in the next 3 hours. Now I need to like shape up and get it done. Eventually, you sit down, you focus because the deadline is approaching, and you finish it and you do a great job. So you end up at the same place, here and here, same place. You still do a great job because you're capable of doing that great job in that amount of time. Except that now you've wasted 3 extra hours doing it, right? And now instead of going home and relaxing, you've spent 3 extra hours at work, or instead of finishing another task and having like a less stressful day tomorrow, you've spent those 3 hours finishing that job. So that's kind of an illustration of what happens with the procrastination or the perfectionism freeze response, which often translates to procrastination. So what's underneath perfectionism? Like, why do we do this to ourselves? Well, here's what often happens. On the surface, it's kind of like an iceberg. It's not obviously a triangle, not an iceberg, but that was the idea I was going for with this graphic. On the top of it, like above water, what we see is this desire to do great work, right? Like that's what a lot of us define perfectionism as, and that's why a lot of us are often like, why would I want to change that? It's desire to do great work. This is what it looks like on the surface. What's beneath that actually, and what's beneath chasing that? We're not actually chasing great work, we're chasing perfection. Beneath that is this fear of making mistakes or missing something, right? Like we're so scared of what if something's missing that that's why we try to make it perfect. If it's perfect, can't miss something, right? And what's even deeper below that is this fear of what we will think and feel about ourselves if a mistake does happen. So often we visualize like what would others think and say, like what would my boss say, what would my colleagues think? They'll think I'm incompetent, they'll not trust me anymore, they'll think I'm unreliable. That is, yes, that is all scary because we're all social creatures and we care about what others think about us. That's why, like, don't care what others think is never good advice. It's a topic for for another session. Um, so that is legitimately scary for a lot of us, or for all of us, really. But what's even scarier is how mean we're gonna be to ourselves. Like we kind of picture going home that day after having made a mistake, after having a difficult conversation with our boss about like why did this happen, and feeling like shit, like feeling absolutely terrible about ourselves, beating ourselves up, talking to ourselves like in a really mean way. Like, why wasn't I more careful? Am I such an idiot? Why am I not doing things right? Why can't I never get anything right? And now I'm gonna get fired. Now my life is gonna be over. Like, we go into this really deep place of and dark place of being really, really mean to ourselves. And that is at the root of why it's so scary to make a mistake or for things to not be perfect. So yeah, on the outside, it seems like, no, just desire to do great work. And beneath that is like this really, really deep fear that can be so powerful that, of course, we spend the 3 extra hours over editing stuff or 3 hours procrastinating and freezing. Those fears are really strong and really powerful. Again, trust me, I know from personal example, like I viscerally, like even as I'm talking about it, I can feel kind of the visceral sensations in my body that are associated with those types of fears. So, what's the way out of procrastination? Well, it's a combination of strategy and mindset. And the mindset is incredibly important so that we, again, address, if you go back to the previous slide, we address those deep fears. Because without addressing the deep fears, no amount of strategy is ever going to actually stick. But in terms of, I'll talk about how to start working on mindset and address those fears in the next slide. But I do want to make 2 points about strategy here before I dive into the mindset. In terms of strategy, one thing that can be incredibly helpful is kind of starting to differentiate in your job the tasks that do sometimes require a little bit extra attention and the tasks where you can build in a lot of breathing room. Because again, perfectionists have this all or nothing thinking, and we have a hard time differentiating when, like for us, everything requires the extra attention, right? There's no such thing as like there's a task with breathing room. But I'll give you an example from the work I used to do in econ consulting. So there would be some tasks that would go into an expert report that then would be like scrutinized in court, would go in front of a judge, would be scrutinized by opposing counsel side. Basically, there would be whole teams of economists on the other side whose only job is looking for mistakes in what you did. So it was something that we tried very hard to make very accurate and not have any mishaps or mistakes that would get checked multiple times, audited multiple times. Like those were the tasks where it would require us actually doing that extra work and requiring that extra attention. And then there would be a lot of times when the tasks were not that serious. Like we would need to just make an estimate for like an internal reference that, yeah, we want it to be accurate. Of course, we always want our estimates and work to be accurate, but it maybe doesn't need to be, the data doesn't need to be scrutinized to an extent where you spend like weeks and weeks going through it, you do a quick review of the data and you do some quick results with all the caveats that come with that. And then we, of course, would like footnote and caveat, like we haven't done this yet, or we haven't done this yet. So these results like are still very preliminary. Like you put all the appropriate caveats there, but there are situations where we just want those preliminary results just to get an idea of like what's the ballpark of things. And then as we start refining analyses, we go in deeper and deeper and put in more and more of that extra attention to remove the caveats. But there would be many cases, or like, let's give an example of a different task. There's sometimes like a colleague wants you to just quickly like estimate something for them. That's again, it's not going in a report, it's not going in front of a judge, it's not going to the client, it's just for internal reference. Again, that doesn't need to be like scrutinized for 6 hours. You can just do something quick and tell them like this is a really quick, just don't take it as the final estimate, but here it is. So sort of learning how to start differentiating of like where are some things where I can build in some breathing room. And this goes for your personal life too. It's not just at work. Like at home, like if you want to clean your room, does it have to be deep clean and like kind of spring cleaning, like getting rid of things and dusting everywhere? Or can you do something where there's more breathing room and it feels tidier and it feels better, but it's not kind of the most extensive version of the thing? So starting to pay attention, teaching your brain to kind of starting to pay attention, like where are the tasks where I can build in breathing room and where are the tasks that require some extra attention. Then learning how to gradually simplify some tasks and kind of focus on the most impactful parts of a project. This is in some ways similar and in some ways different than what I just described. It's similar in the sense that like the tasks where you can build some breathing room, which is honestly for a lot of our jobs, that's most of the tasks. So again, there are things that will be more scrutinized, that will be more formal, that will get published, that require that extra scrutiny. And a lot of the day-to-day stuff that we do doesn't require quite that level of scrutiny. We try to do our best. We try to make it very accurate, but we don't need to spend 6 hours editing everything. So looking for ways of like, what is the most impactful part of this project? How can I focus on that? That's kind of the concept of working smarter, not harder, right? Like in consulting, it's the 80-20 rule, where like 80% of the outcomes can come from 20% of the efforts. This is oversimplified. Don't come for me. I know this is not exactly the 80-20. There's a lot of nuances there, but at a very like high level, for the sake of simplifying and illustrating this bullet, that's the 80-20 rule. So sort of looking for the most impactful parts of a project. And if I do them, I will have a really good kind of outcome or something really solid, even if I didn't get every single thing done or finalized or kind of perfected. So that's in terms of strategy, what I really recommend is kind of learning where those places are of breathing room, of like ways you can simplify things. Just asking yourself, how can I simplify this? When you're sitting in front of something and it looks too daunting and it looks too scary, just teaching yourself to think, how can I simplify this can be really powerful. Okay, and then we come to the mindset part, addressing those fears of producing work that is less than perfect. So, how do we do that? I have an example here of some of the mindset work. Again, this is, of course, not an extensive guide to how to do mindset work because um, it does get more complicated than that. But this is a really good kind of primer for you to have in your back pocket when you want to work on some of those thoughts and some of those fears that come up with perfectionism. So, step one, is figuring out the thing you currently believe. So, being really honest with yourself of what do I currently believe, even if you know logically that it's not true. So that's a kind of a tricky thing to do before you're familiar with mindset work and retraining your brain and rewiring your brain. It can be really weird to kind of tap into the duality of sometimes we believe something logically, and yet there's a visceral part of us that doesn't believe it. We're talking to that visceral part, the fear part of your brain, not the prefrontal cortex, not the logical part. So let's say that fear part of your brain says, if I make a mistake, that's all people are going to remember. about me. That might be a really powerful thought that's creating a lot of fear. Like, I don't want to be remembered by that one mistake. And if I believe that's what's going to happen, it's creating a lot of fear. Maybe your thought is like, this will ruin my reputation. I have a reputation for being careful and reliable. Making a mistake is just going to ruin it. Maybe your thought is like, the main thing I contribute to this job, to this case, to this project is my attention to detail. So then if I make a mistake, then what? Like then the thing that I contributed is gone. And what's my value? I'm gonna get kicked off the project, I might get fired. Like it's again just getting really curious about what those thoughts are and writing them down. I love writing things down on paper because it, first of all, or it can just be electronically if you don't like writing on paper. I love writing on paper. Because number one, it like they exit your brain, and that in itself is at least a little bit of a relief, sometimes a big relief, just writing them down somewhere so they don't have to just keep swirling in your brain. And then also, once you see them on paper, you can move on to the next steps. You can figure out what the thoughts are. You have them again right in front of you, so you don't have to kind of keep searching for them in your brain, and you can figure out the next steps. And what the next steps are, step two is figuring out alternative thoughts that feel believable. And this is really crucial. Like a lot of people try to go from their current thought to the other extreme. So, for instance, if your current thought is like a mistake would ruin my reputation, you might try to go to like, well, mistakes don't matter and my reputation can never be harmed. That's unhelpful because, first of all, it probably isn't true that like mistakes never matter. And second, like, even if it were true, it just doesn't feel believable to your brain because you're trying to go straight to the other extreme. So instead, we're looking for nuance, which is perfectionist brains hate it, but that's what we need to do. Some nuance, finding a thought that feels at least slightly better than the current thought. So for instance, that can be something like, there is a chance others think about my mistakes less than I do. Adding some caveats like there's a possibility, there's a chance, there's like a slight, like a 1% likelihood. I like to play with whatever feels better in the moment for me, but sort of adding some caveats, it doesn't feel as inspirational, but it feels a little bit better. And that's what we're going for because that's what's going to stick with your brain as you practice it. Another example could be there's a chance mistakes don't have as big of an impact as I currently think. Or I contribute to this case or this project. I keep saying case because that's what projects were called in consulting, but some other jobs it's not called cases. Whenever I say case, I mean project. Um, I contribute to this case in several different ways. So it's not just my attention to detail, it's my attention to detail and this, like, and sort of maybe even listing for yourself. What are the other ways in which you contribute? And then once you find that alternative thought or thoughts that feel slightly better, step three is reminding yourself of those new thoughts a few times a day. Every time you remind yourself of the new thought, it starts to build these, or it helps to build these new neural pathways. So you can set a reminder on your phone, you can write a post-it note and put it on your screen, whatever it is. It doesn't take a lot of time. It just takes like a couple of minutes a day. But redirecting your brain a few times a day can be really powerful and can start, again, building new pathways. And over time, you find that that fear, that really visceral fear from the iceberg starts to melt and it might not disappear entirely, but it's not that big anymore. It starts to melt and it becomes smaller. All right, let's move on to people pleasing. So, again, the way people pleasing shows up at work is often by overcommitting our time and or promising results. So, let me paint you a picture. You get a request from your manager at 5 p.m. on a Friday. And obviously it's really, really unpleasant to do for that to happen because then like if they say this is due before Monday or this is due by tomorrow, which happens a lot in consulting. It's not the fact that it's the weekend often doesn't mean much. So then your Friday night is shot, your weekend is potentially ruined, whatever plans you had, like if you say yes to this request, that really sucks, right? But it feels like you're kind of stuck between two terrible choices because you're thinking, okay, if I'm saying I'm not available, I'm gonna feel super guilty about that. I'm gonna overthink that. I'm gonna be trying to relax over the weekend, but thinking about how I've just ruined my career because I said no to this project, how people are annoyed at me, how people think I'm not a team player, and you like feel super guilty. Option two, you agree to do the task, but have a terrible Friday evening, a terrible weekend potentially, and then you feel exhausted and resentful. So it feels like you're literally stuck between two terrible choices. But when we think those are our only two options, a lot of us would pick option two. Because even if it is quite terrible to be working Friday night, to be working over the weekend, to be feeling like exhausted and resentful, it still for a lot of us feels less terrible than that guilt that we carry and that fear of like, well, what was the point of my hard work until now if I now ruin it by saying no to this one request? Like I basically just ruined years of hard work or months of hard work. So when we think those are our only two options, most of us would end up picking option two, and that's how we get stuck being overworked and in that cycle of exhaustion and stress and burnout. So the good news is that there is actually an option three. You can actually get more realistic about the outcomes of saying no, essentially, of the outcomes of either saying no or having some parameters around it. Maybe you say, like, I can stay a couple of extra hours tonight, but then I have plans and then I'm out this weekend. So I'll finish it up Monday and then have a conversation about that. Whatever the version is, it doesn't have to just be like always a strict no. It can be some give and take, whatever is doable, whatever makes sense for you, but sort of not immediately agreeing to all of it. The fear there is often my manager will think I'm not doing a good job, or again, my reputation will be ruined. What is actually more realistic than what the fear part of your brain is telling you is that the quality of your work ultimately is always going to matter more than the quantity. And quality of work suffers when you take on tasks that are beyond your capacity. So when you take on more than you can, whether that's in terms of time, in terms of availability, capacity, anything, you lose sleep, you feel resentful, you don't get a chance to relax, you don't get a chance to connect with the people in your life, and you're way more actually likely to make mistakes, to fall behind on work, to compromise the rest of your cases, to have to be taken off a case sometimes. That makes the quality of your work suffer, and that is always going to be more impactful than how much you were able to get done. So, in the grand scheme of things, even if, and we actually can't know what your manager is thinking in the moment, but even if they were thinking, oh my gosh, that's annoying that they can't work this Friday evening, in the grand scheme of things, like in the span of a quarter, in the span of like half a year, they will remember how good your work was, like what was the quality of the work product. They're probably not going to remember all the times in which you ruined your Friday nights and weekends and ended up making some mistakes as a process in the process. That actually is going to be more detrimental to your career. So just thinking of it in this way of like protecting, having some boundaries and protecting my energy, my capacity, my um, personal life is actually more beneficial in the long run for my career. So my reputation might suffer more if I keep saying yes to everything. Second fear that often comes up is I will be perceived as difficult or unprofessional if I say something like, I can't work Friday evening or I can't work over the weekend. My perspective here as somebody who has been on both sides of that conversation. I've been the person having to have the conversation around like I can't work this weekend and the person who has had people tell me I can't work the weekend. Even when we had like I always hated asking people to work over the weekend, and sometimes it was like put like a completely kind of inevitable in a way, but I still really, even in those situations when it felt inevitable and it felt really stressful, I have had people who had extremely professional conversations with me about why that might not be possible. And I've always really appreciated that. And I've done my best to honor that. So there's a very professional way to have the conversation around I can't work this Friday or I can't work this weekend. It doesn't have to be just like no when you slam the phone. I know none of you were planning to do that, but you know what I mean. Like it doesn't have to come across as rude or unprofessional. There's an extremely professional way to have those conversations, and we can practice like ways to phrase things and ways to say things. But just for now, like I want you to keep in mind that that is not the only or even the likely outcome. Is just that you'll be perceived as difficult and unprofessional, and that's it. You can also just discuss trade-offs and provide alternatives during the conversation. So, for instance, if your manager is asking, it's a Wednesday, and they're asking, like, can we get this thing done by Friday? You look at the thing, you estimate how long it's going to take to do like an extensive job on it, and you discover that it's not possible in 2 days unless like the whole team doesn't sleep for 2 days. But you go back to your manager and you say, the full thing is not doable by Friday, but here's what we could do. We could only, like, let's say, analyze the last 2 years of data instead of the last 10 years because the other 8 years are in a different data set that hasn't been cleaned. That's going to take much longer. For example, so sort of providing some alternatives of like, we can have some results by Friday. We're not going to have all the results by Friday. Again, as someone who has been a manager, I've appreciated this so deeply every time somebody came to me and was like, what we are hoping to do isn't doable, but here's what we can do instead. Love it. Amazing. So just keeping in mind that there's many different options and nuances there that don't have to and that are not at all unprofessional or difficult and are in fact extremely helpful. All right, third topic, procrastination. And we have about 20 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to wrap this up in the next kind of 10, 15 minutes or so and see if there are any questions at the end. So, procrastination at work. Why does it happen? It happens, and if you've seen some of my content online, that's the one thing I always say is you can't just kind of try to power through procrastination. You have to first of all figure out why is it happening in this particular moment, because there can be many different reasons why procrastination happens. And it's not always the same thing, and the same solution wouldn't always work, or sometimes just trying to power through almost never works. It does for some people. I shouldn't say never. It does for some people. I know some people who are like, I just tell myself, get it together and do the work, and then I get up and do the work. I'm like, that is incredible, and I honestly can't relate at all because it doesn't work for my brain in the least. But I love that it works for you, and that is, I'm in awe of that, and that's incredible. Um, so anyway, first step is figuring out what is the reason behind your procrastination so that we know like what we need to address and how to address it. So there can be many different reasons, but here's like some of the kind of high level overarching ones. Often it's because of overwhelm. Whether you're overwhelmed because you have way too much on your plate and you're kind of like not don't know where to start, it's one big mishmash of things. And if that's the case, like when I work one-on-one with my clients, we come up with a strategy, like with that literally with a schedule and time management strategy of like this day is going to be these three tasks, this day these three, et cetera, et cetera. So sort of parsing through the long list, like running list of things and coming up with a very specific to-do list for the day that focuses on the few core tasks, and it becomes a lot more manageable to look at. So that's one reason people procrastinate is like there's just too much. They see the running list, they get overwhelmed, and again, they just go and clean the bathroom instead, or just go and sit on the couch and scroll TikTok instead. Then there's feeling intimidated by a task. So there's a different type of overwhelm there. Maybe you don't have too many tasks on your list, you just have one task, but that one task feels overwhelming and intimidating. You're like, I don't even know where to start. Maybe you have to write like a long report or a memo, and you're like, there's too many moving pieces. I kind of don't know how to approach this, or I don't know enough about the subject. How do I even start? So basically, like the not knowing where to start overwhelm. Then there's a fear of disappointing someone, which also creates overwhelm, actually. Like, so maybe those two bullets are kind of lumped together and go hand in hand. But there's a fear of like, if I don't do a good enough job at this, someone is gonna be disappointed. And then again, this kind of puts you in this panic and freeze mode of like, I don't know how to start this. And then there's sometimes just plain fatigue or trouble focusing on a particular day or just boredom. I've kind of lumped them in the same bullet point because those are all kind of the low energy states of you don't have a ton of energy, whether physical or mental, or you have a lot of brain fog. It's just hard. Things feel harder. And when things feel harder, we just can't do them with like the same intensity we usually want to do them with. And often, like, we shut down instead of trying to do them with less intensity, which is what I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides. In all three of those cases, or any other, again, this is not an extensive list, so there could be many other reasons we're procrastinating. This is kind of like the big overarching categories. But in any of those cases, the first step is to always work on your thoughts that you're having in the moment, doing that mindset work, managing your thoughts in your brain. And then we move on to strategy because, again, with procrastination, we first need to address what's happening internally. Our nervous system is trying to protect us. When we're procrastinating, our nervous system is seeing something that's scary or stressful or overwhelming, and it's like, let's not go there. This feels like a lot. Let's stay over here where it's safe. So doing that mindset work to take down the level of threat that we feel from the task, that's gonna help like make it a lot more manageable and a lot easier to move into the work instead of just feeling this like dreadful wall of terror and trying to kind of break through it. For some reason, my brain went to been rewatching a lot of Game of Thrones. My brain went to the wall from Game of Thrones. If you have like the wall next to you of terror and you're like trying to climb it, we all know, well, not we all, but whoever is a fan of Game of Thrones knows what happens like when you try to climb the wall. It's not easy. It's really, really challenging and difficult. So of course, our nervous system's like, let's not try to do that. But what if we can melt that wall? And then it's not that scary. That's why mindset has to come first with procrastination. Um, and one thing I want to say before I even jump into any of that is that regardless of the reason you're procrastinating, judging yourself makes it a lot worse and a lot harder to get out of. And unfortunately, that's the go-to for the vast majority of us. We procrastinate and we feel shitty about it. We tell ourselves, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't everybody else do their work? I can't. Why can't I get out of this? I've been struggling with this for years. And so we go on and on and on in those narratives. We feel absolutely terrible. Guess what happens? That adds to that wall. That adds to that like wall of ice that is really terrifying, and it actually makes the problem worse. We think that if we just yell at ourselves enough, we're gonna shape up and get going. Again, there might be some people who that works for. The vast majority of people who I work with, or whether in coaching or in consulting, that hasn't worked for. Mm. And the other thing I want to say about procrastination is that it can feel really lonely. But I want to reassure you that it's an unbelievably common problem. I am yet to meet anybody, whether it's a client of mine or like anybody in my personal life, where when I mention procrastination, their reaction is, I never struggle with that. I don't know what that is. That is yet to happen. Literally everybody, when I mention procrastination, is like, oh, help me. Like, what do I do? Everybody struggles with it. And in the workplace, it can feel very lonely and isolating because not a lot of people show up on conference calls saying, oh, I just spent 2 hours procrastinating this morning. People show up on conference calls trying to project like competence and productivity, and they like talk about how much work they've done, even if they did procrastinate for 2 hours that morning. But as a result, everybody feels like they are alone and they are hiding like a little secret when it's everybody on that conference call has procrastinated like today. I guarantee it. Because guess what? We're not robots. That's the other thing to remember is procrastination is just so human. And we're not robots. We're not machines who can sit down and just do thing after thing after thing. Yeah, we can try to like change our relationship with it and get out of it if we're getting to a stage where it feels like really unpleasant to be procrastinating. But everybody procrastinates, and there's absolutely no reason to judge yourself for that. So, again, I just want to emphasize mindset extremely important here. And I would refer back to slide 8, the slide with all the mindset examples of like how to start exploring your thoughts and working on your mindset, whatever the reason for procrastination is. And When I work with clients one-on-one, we do that like in a very obviously way that's customized to them. We explore exactly what's happening with them. I help them through the process of thinking of new thoughts, coming up, practicing, rewiring. But it is important to remember that it is a practice. It's not like you're going to think a new thought, your brain immediately is going to take to that, and the old thoughts are gone. That's not how human brains work. We can't just swap one thought for another and stop thinking about the other thing. That's never how anything works. We add on new thoughts, practice them, and over time we start rewiring our brain. I want you to think about that. I'm spending more time on this than I was intending to, but it's really important. So stick with me here. I want you to think about rewiring your brain the same way you would think about building new muscle. If you want to, let's say, strengthen your bicep, what are you going to do? You're going to find some exercises that strengthen the bicep, and you're going to go to the gym a few times a week and do those exercises, right? What you're not going to do is do one bicep curl one time and say, like, what's happening? My bicep didn't change. Why is this not working? We understand that very logically when it comes to like working a muscle, but we get extremely impatient when it comes to like working with our brains. And it's the exact same process. We need to finding a new thought is kind of like finding the exercise, but then we need to practice it and repeat it. And over time, we start seeing like, okay, it's a little bit easier for me, for my brain to like default to that and not default to my usual thought that I've thought 7 million times. Of course, that's easier. Right? Like over time, you start noticing how it's easier and easier for your brain to like move in a different direction than its default. But it takes that kind of patience and practice. And that's where like having a coach and working with someone one-on-one can be really invaluable because you have that support, you have someone to guide you through the process. When you hit a wall and you're like, this is really frustrating, nothing is sticking, nothing is working, you have somebody to walk you through that and help you. All right, moving on to actual strategy for procrastination. So after you've done some of that mindset work, let's say you're having a hard time starting. So that's kind of the overwhelm that I was talking about. Some things that could be really helpful, and this is like some mindset work here too. Often when we don't want to start is because, or not that we don't want to start, we want to start, but we can't get ourselves to start is because we're visualizing the end product. We're like, I'm here and I need to get here and I just don't know how to get from here to here. Of course you don't. That's too many steps. Let's think about the first step. There is utility in just doing 10 minutes. 10 minutes may, for perfectionist brains, it seems useless. Perfect. That's exactly, if your perfectionist brain says something is useless, that's actually what you need to be doing because that's what's sustainable. So let's just start and do 10 minutes. After those 10 minutes, I promise you're going to either get some inertia and keep going, or you're going to have a much better idea of what's the next step. What are some things I need to research? What are some things I need to start? You're going to have a clearer picture. It's going to feel slightly less overwhelming than it did 10 minutes ago. So just do 10 minutes and then pause. You don't have to force yourself to keep going unless you want to, but just do 10 minutes. It's going to be helpful. There's also a lot of utility in doing things imperfectly on the first pass. And just in general, again, going back to like, there's no such thing as perfect. But especially for a first draft, I want you to keep remembering that. First drafts are meant to be imperfect and glitchy and wonky and all of those things. That's why it's called a first draft. But often we try to like make the first draft perfect and we're intimidated by it and we're like, I don't want to start because it's not going to be good. Of course it's not going to be good. It's the first draft. Then you reread it and you edit it and you make it better. What I was talking to a client a couple of months ago, but I remember the conversation because it's very relevant. She was trying to write a memo and she was feeling kind of in that ex exact space of like, I don't know how to start. It's too much, it's too kind of tricky. I can't really do a really good memo. So she wasn't starting because she couldn't do a great memo on the first pass. And I asked her, in the next like hour and a half after our coaching call, can you do a really shitty version of the memo? She's like, oh, yeah, of course. That's easy. I can do like a really like a shitty version. Go and do that. In the first hour and a half after our call, just go and write like a very kind of wonky version of the memo. And then I'm not saying send it out. I'm not saying like after you write that first wonky version, you immediately like are done and send it out. But guess what? In the end of that hour, you're going to have a draft to work with. You're going to see where the gaps are. You're going to see what needs to be edited. And if that feels easy, if it feels easy to write that wonky version in the next hour, let's just go and do that. So reminding yourself like there's a lot of utility of doing it imperfectly, and first drafts are meant to be unpolished. And then once you start, you can start a running list of things to do. Like a running list of things like as you start writing, you're like, okay, I need to learn more about this. I need to find out more about this. I need to skip this and talk to someone about it later. You start a running list, but again, you're now working on it and you're in the process. What if you're in one of those kind of low energy states of you're just tired or you're bored or you're having trouble focusing? Okay, here's some strategy things to do there. Number one is rest if you have the option to. I know that sometimes you're in the middle of the workday and you're like, I don't know what that looks like. If you're not in the middle of the workday in the office and you have the option to take like a 30-minute nap, absolutely, naps can do wonders. Go for a walk, talk to a friend, just take a break, just listen to some music. A client of mine recently started incorporating kind of mini breaks in her workday, and she was texting me saying, like, you're not gonna believe how much of a difference this is making to my day. I'm like, I do believe that. Absolutely believe that. So starting to incorporate like small breaks here and there. Then maybe gamifying, making like whatever you're working on, turning it into a play to make it like more playful and lowering that intensity. Because again, when we're low energy, that intensity can feel like really, really daunting. The intensity with which we usually approach things. So just making it turning it into a game can be really helpful. So for instance, giving yourself an artificial deadline, like let's say in the next hour, how much of this can I do? Or in the next 20 minutes. Like if somebody told me you need to send this out in 20 minutes, what would be like the things that I would patch together to have something to present in 20 minutes? That again gets your brain thinking of like what are some core points I can start working on. And I find that really fun, at least. Maybe for some people, an artificial deadline would be stressful. If so, you don't need to do that. You can ditch that. Starting from the fun part of a project. So people always say, or often say, start with the hardest part and then that's out of the way. There can be a lot of utility in that, yes. And if you're in this low energy state, especially, starting with the most daunting part is not a good strategy. You're just going to want to avoid it. So what if you start with the fun part instead? Or at least the easy. If there's no fun part, at least like what's the easiest part I can start with? And then another big kind of practical trick that works wonders is like interrupting the procrastination without immediately switching to work. So, for instance, if you're scrolling on your phone and your brain is like, this, we need to stop scrolling so we can start working. Your brain and nervous system in that moment think that the second you stop the scroll, you need to jump into work. That's too daunting and too big of a transition. And so, of course, you're going to want to watch another video. You're like, no. If the alternative to another video is jumping straight into work, of course, another video is more pleasurable. And that's how you get stuck in that loop. Even if the videos are no longer fun and your eyes are hurting at this point, right? So, in those moments, what I recommend is just interrupt the scroll. You're like, okay, my eyes hurt. Let me just set the phone down for a second. I do not need to switch immediately to work. I'm just gonna close my eyes for a second. I'm just gonna stare at the wall. I'm just gonna get up and like grab some coffee or grab a drink. Interrupting in itself can be super powerful. And then after some time, then you reset and maybe it feels easier to switch to work. Or maybe it doesn't, but at least there's been utility in interrupting the thing that feels heavy in that moment. And then lowering the stakes so that you can do the thing with less energy or with low energy. So a lot of the times, again, the intensity with which we usually approach things is what makes things hard. So lowering that intensity, like asking yourself, what are some ways in which I can do this with less intensity today? And doing that. That often makes a big difference for me when I wake up on those days and I'm like really brain fog, really tired. I'm like, okay, how can I move through the day without my without the really heightened intensity? How can I slow things down? How can I make things easier for myself? And that makes it possible for me to keep moving. Okay, this was a lot of stuff that I covered, but I'm almost done, I promise. I just want to talk about the application gap for a second, which is essentially this gap between knowing what you need to do and being able to apply that knowledge. And that's where it gets really frustrating trying to solve stress and burnout at work, is often we say like, okay, I know that trying to be like perfect is impossible and it's exhausting and I'm doing too much. And yet, when I'm sitting in front of the email that I need to send, and I am about to hit the send button, I just can't. I want to edit it one more time just to be extra sure. And then that turns into two more times, three more times, etc., etc. So knowing that this is exhausting and being able to apply it in the moment, not the same thing. Because often that application gap here in the middle, that's where fear comes in. That is where you get overwhelmed. You're scared of like, oh no, but what if I do make a mistake and someone's upset and like we go into all that spin. So then it's just there's a break between what you know and applying the knowledge. Similarly, like you may know on paper, overcommitting my time is exhausting and counterproductive, but then your boss calls at 5 p.m. on a Friday and it's unbelievably hard in that moment to say, I'm not able to work this weekend. So all that knowledge goes out the window because again, fear gets in the way. Also, for procrastination, you know that just working on my project is going to make me feel so much better. I hear that all the time. Like, why do I do this when I know that just working on the project is going to make me feel better? Because again, fear gets in the way, overwhelm gets in the way, that wall gets in the way, and getting yourself to actually start instead of like picking all the distractions feels impossible. That's where working with a coach can be really invaluable. That's how I got out of all of those patterns. I got myself a coach back in the day, like that was pre-COVID, when I was feeling really work stress and really burnt out at work. I got myself a coach who helped me work through all of these patterns through a combination of mindset, nervous system work, and strategy. So when we work one-on-one together, I will help you bridge that gap between like understanding and applying. And I will help you do it in a way that feels sustainable for you. So I'm not going to kind of advise you to do things that feel terrifying, like just march into your boss's office and say, not working weekends ever again. Like, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to be doing things that feel impossible and scary and also counterproductive, honestly. We're going to be working again on mindset, on alleviating those fears, on nervous system regulation, and then on strategy. But the strategy is always going to be what feels doable and accessible to you in the moment and building from there. The cost of staying stuck is really high. Trust me. Like the cost of being stuck in that stress and that exhaustion and that burnout, they really just affect our ability to enjoy things, to relate to others, like capacity to, I'm not just talking about spending time with family and friends, which is obviously a big thing that is impacted and is one of the most important things in life. I'm talking about even other types of interactions. So I remember when I was really kind of stressed at work, I felt like a zombie walking through the streets. Like I would just walk through the streets and like mentally recite all the things I need to do during the day, thinking about like my stata code that I need to write, thinking about like all those things. And I wouldn't notice that I'm like bumping into someone on the street. I was being like an asshole on the street because I was just completely inconsiderate because I was so into my head and so wrapped up in my stress. So that work stress kind of robs us of our ability to relate to other people. And that is no way to go through life. And telling yourself, like, someday I'll relax or someday I'll fix it, that someday doesn't come until you decide to change how you're used to working, how you're used to thinking about work. Just waiting for things to magically resolve on their own is never gonna come. You might change jobs, you're gonna take the same patterns with you to the next job. So taking that, you need to do that like intentionally and decide to make a change. Um, Next steps or options for what you can do. You can work with me one-on-one for 6 weeks. Well, it doesn't have to be 6 weeks. I should have said 6 sessions here. It's essentially 6 sessions, a package of six 45-minute sessions. It can be weekly or it can be, I have clients who do weekly, I have clients who do bi-weekly, and I have clients who do monthly, whatever kind of cadence works for you. But we work together over 6 sessions, and I help you bridge that application gap between knowing and being able to apply that knowledge. And I am happy to chat. I haven't written it down here, but I'm happy to share. The cost for the 6 sessions is $750 dollars, and it includes the 6 sessions of us working together, in addition to just unlimited support over email in between sessions or text with some clients, depending on their comfort level. Sometimes my clients just want to text about issues in between calls. So I've been doing that with a couple of my clients in the last few days where they're like, my boss gave me this feedback and I'm freaking the fuck out. What do I do? And we've kind of talked it out over text because we don't have a call until tomorrow. So it includes that unlimited support of written support, whether over email or text, for the duration of the program. So if you decide to do like 6 monthly sessions, that means like 6 months, you might also have that written support. Not might, you will have that written support. So if all of that sounds good to you, you can just go straight to signing up. You can send me an email, info@restovergrind.com, and ask me any other questions you have, and we'll talk about like logistics and scheduling our call. Or if you want to chat some more and have some additional questions, you can book a 30-minute consult call during which we will get to know each other, assess compatibility, and figure out if we're a good match to work together. All right, I am going to stop sharing, but thank you everybody so much for joining today. I don't see any questions, but if anybody has any questions that they want to share right now, please do. And if you are feeling nervous about sharing right now, but you want to, something comes up after you hang up or later tonight or over the weekend, send me an email and ask me to say like, hey, I was thinking about this thing during the webinar and I'm confused, or I have a follow-up question, or how do I apply this? Send me an email and we will talk about it. But thank you so much for joining and being here.